Hello, and welcome to the TechZero Python learning course. In this video, we're going to be covering loops. What is a loop? A loop is a block of code that will loop through itself a certain number of times while a condition that you set up is true. Python has two loop types. You have while loops and for loops. First, we're going to look at some while loops. A while loop will continue to loop as long as the condition you set up is true. So let's say that we want to, let's say we say I is equal to 0. And while I is less than 10, we will print I, and we will increase I by 1. Now this step is actually quite important, right here. Because if we don't increment I by 1, or whatever number we want, if we don't change I, this will become an infinite while loop. That's something you always want to be aware of and be careful of while you're writing loops, is you want to avoid, unless you're explicitly trying to make one, you want to avoid an infinite loop. So if we run this, we will see that we will get the numbers 0 through 9. Because once I reaches 10, it is no longer less than 10, and the loop exits. Another way that we can exit a loop if we want to is we'll say if I is equal to, let's just choose 7, we use the break command. The break command, if it's encountered in a loop, will totally end the loop. It'll just exit it right there. So once I hit 7, we're not going to run the print statement. We're not going to increment I. We're just going to break out. We'll print I afterwards, so we see what it is after that. Print I, indent properly. And we'll see that if I print a blank line first, just to make sure, this gets printed out in the loop. And then we get a 7 outside the loop because the loop broke when I hit 7. Alternatively, you can use the continue statement. And that will, instead of just breaking the loop outright, that will end the current iteration and restart the next iteration. So be careful with this, because if I leave this here, I will always be 7 and we will be stuck in an infinite loop. So what we're going to do instead is, so for the time being, we're going to stick one of these in here so that even if we hit a continue, it'll still iterate I and we don't get stuck in an infinite loop. And we'll see 7 gets skipped over when it gets printed out because we had a continue statement in the condition that I is equal to 7. Now, like an if statement, you can use an else statement with a while loop. It doesn't work like an else statement does with an if statement. Instead, it will run a block of code after the loop exits. So we'll say print loop done. And we'll see that after the loop exits, we'll get this else statement executing. Please note that that else statement will only run if the loop exits as a result of its condition no longer being true. If we use the break statement here, you'll see that the else statement does not run. Then moving on to for loops. A for loop does not behave the same way that you'd expect it would if you're coming from C++ or Java. A for loop in Python is used to iterate through an iterable object, such as a collection or a string or a range of numbers. So let's say we have the string name is equal to Jack. So we can say for letter in Jack, not Jack, name, print letter. A string is iterable, which is to say you can iterate through each character in the string. And so we'll say for letter in name, that is pulling each iterable thing in the string out and calling it letter for each iteration of the loop. We're going to print out that item. So in this case with a string, it's just each character in the word Jack. If we have a list, let's say my list is equal to 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8. We can say for x in my list, print out x. It behaves basically exactly the same way. Now let's say you want it to behave a little more like a for loop does in C++ or Java. For that, you can use the range function. So we'll say, get rid of the list real quick. We'll say for I in range, we'll say range 10, print I. And that'll behave very similarly to the while loop we had. Notice that the 10 is excluded. As with a lot of things in Python, if you have a range of things, the right side boundary is excluded from the range. You can also specify, let's say 0, 10, that'll do the same thing. Or we can start the range at 5, and that'll print out between 5 and 9. Range can be used in other places other than for statements. You can assign a variable to it, so I'll say my range is equal to range 5, 10. And then we'll print out my range, see what it gives us. And we'll see it is a range between 5 and 10. And now we can say for I in my range, and that'll work, no problem. A range is an object and can be iterated through with a label as opposed to just passing the function directly to the for statement. You can also add a third parameter here, and we'll say 2. This third parameter is the steps that the range will take. So whereas this defaults to, I'll move this to 11 just to give a little bit more room, and this 4, while the default step is 1, so it'll go 5 plus 1, 6, plus 1, 7, plus 1, 8. If we pass it 2, it'll go up 4, 6, 8, 10. It'll go up in 2. If we pass it 3, it'll give us 4, 7, and then 10. If we say 10 on the left side and 0 on the right side, and then a -1, we'll get a range that counts down. If we say 0, 10, and a step of 0.5, we get an error. That's because ranges contain only integer values. If you want to do something like this with floating point values, you can use a library called NumPy. Say import NumPy as NP. NP can be whatever you want it to be. I'll even demonstrate. That's just a label we'll use to reference the functions in NumPy. So we'll say whatever dot arange, and that is the NumPy equivalent. And if you spell whatever correctly, it'll actually work. And we'll see. Now we have the range between 0 and 9.5 in steps 0.5. Notice it does not return a range object. It returns a list. That's because range objects can only contain integer values. So in this case, it'll just create a list and pass that back. But it'll still work in this context, no problem. The syntax works regardless. Like the while loop, the break, continue, and else statements work exactly the same for a for loop. You can also have a loop within a loop. So we'll say for I in my range, print I, but we'll also in here say while, well, we'll create another variable out here, x is equal to 0. While x is less than 5, print x. And then outside of the while loop, we will reset x to 0, or else we'll have no repeating inner loop. And we'll also add our incrementer inside the while loop. Elsewise, we'll get an infinite loop. And we'll see. We print out our I, so 0.0, then we print out 1 through 4 in the while loop. And then 0.5, and the same thing. It keeps going, just keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, until we get to 9.5, and we print out 0 through 4, and we're done. Be very careful when you're nesting loops, though. Having even one nested loop can increase the time complexity of your program significantly. A loop that iterates, let's say, n times within another loop that also iterates n times will loop n squared times overall. And if you have another loop in that, that'll be n cubed, and it keeps going up, and it just gets very, very slow. So just keep that in mind when you're writing your loops.